cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Almost 70% of the people now live in extreme poverty. I've heard harrowing stories from people caught up in the conflict and violence that engulf their community. In Homs, I saw whole districts with row upon row of homes and businesses reduced to rubble. And while things are now calmer in parts of the country where many people live, the fighting continues in other areas. Right now, I am particularly concerned about the fate of the besieged people of East Ghouta, about whom my colleague, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, made an important statement yesterday. As the Secretary General's spokesman also said yesterday, the UN has received alarming reports that the only emergency medical centre in Madeira, in besieged Eastern Ghouta, has been damaged in an airstrike, rendering it inoperable. I'm also concerned about reports of continuous shelling from Eastern Ghouta into Damascus city, with consequent civilian casualties. And I'm deeply worried about civilians affected by the upsurge of violence in Idlib and those trapped in horrendous conditions throughout the northeast. My mandate is to ensure humanitarian assistance and protection for everybody who needs it, in accordance with the long-established principles of independence, impartiality, and neutrality, which have been endorsed by all the member states of the United Nations. People affected by the Syria crisis are entitled to help on the basis of need, regardless of other considerations. Agencies supported through the UN's Humanitarian Response Plan, which is developed and implemented through close discussion with the Syrian authorities, have reached an average of 7.5 million people across the country each month over the last year. These agencies have provided life-saving food and medical help, as well as support to sustain essential services, including water and education. I saw some of this in Homs and was encouraged by the cooperation between the authorities there and the United Nations in re-establishing medical services, creating shelters for displaced people, and working to clear the rubble and re-establish livelihoods. The UN's response plan, the humanitarian response plan for Syria, is one of the world's largest sustained emergency aid efforts. It has been made possible by voluntary donations. They totaled $1.7 billion in 2017, with the biggest contributions coming from the US, Germany, the UK, the European Commission on behalf of the member states of the EU, Canada, Norway, Japan and Denmark. These assistance programs have been implemented by thousands of aid workers. Most of them are Syrians, and many are volunteers, working for the organisations of the UN, the Red Cross, NGOs and the Syrian Arab Red Crescent. I pay tribute to their courage and selflessness, recognising that many have lost their lives while assisting others. I also want particularly to recognise and applaud the work of my colleagues in the United Nations humanitarian country teams. I have had detailed and open discussions about the crisis and what more needs to be done to reduce humanitarian suffering with the government. And I've also met local authorities, the diplomatic community and humanitarian organisations. On the basis of these discussions, I am hoping soon to see a number of positive developments, enabling us to sustain and improve the aid effort this year. First, finalisation of the UN's Humanitarian Response Plan for 2018, for which we will be seeking $3.5 billion from donors to meet the needs of more than 13 million people in all parts of Syria. Second, agreement to medical evacuation for hundreds of critically ill people trapped in besieged East Ghouta, building on the initial evacuation of 29 patients, together with some of their family members, 2 weeks ago. People in other besieged areas should get the same help. Third, agreement to 3 or 4 UN and Syrian Arab Red Crescent convoys each week, including both food and medical supplies, across front lines to provide assistance to up to 2.5 million people in besieged and hard-to-reach areas. We need consistent, regular access to all the people in need. Fourth, agreement on UN-supported aid convoys from Damascus to Rukban in southeastern Syria. Fifth, more effective arrangements to enable the UN to support the work of Syrian NGOs and to enable international NGOs to play a stronger role, which they can and which they are ready to do, in relieving the suffering. I discussed a number of other issues related to my mandate with the government and others, including the review of the cross-border programs from neighbouring countries into Syria, which was commissioned last month by the Security Council, and which are approved under Security Council resolutions which recognise the territorial integrity of Syria. I have agreed with the government that we will continue our discussions with a further meeting next week in New York, and possibly subsequent meetings working towards another visit to Syria later in the year. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take a few questions.
تفضلوا. مين بده لحظة. هلا رح نبلش باليسار مع البير، بس بدنا ناخذ 4 أسئلة. أنا بفضل إنه إذا في مجال تسألوهم وبنسجلهم فورا بنجاوب عليهم. تفضل البير، بعدين المدام، بعدين التلفزيون السوري. أنا آسفة، التلفزيون السوري وكمان الأخبار السورية بالإنجليزي. فإذا فضائية سورية. طيب.
مستر لوكوك، هل أنتم واثقون أن المساعدات التي ترسل إلى المناطق الساخنة تصل إلى مستحقيها؟ وكيف تقيمون الوضع الآن في المناطق الساخنة؟ شكرا.
تحدثتم عن إدخال المساعدات إلى الغوطة الشرقية وإلى مخيم ركبان، لكن بالمقابل آلاف من المدنيين محاصرين في كفرية والفوعة لليوم، وليس هنالك أي قلق دولي حول مصيرهم. هل لنا أن نعرف من حضرتكم كيف ستتعاطون مع ملف أهالي كفرية والفوعة؟
Mr. Lowcock, you have just said that you spoke with government officials on various issues, delivery of medical and food assistance and so on, but my question is, are there any efforts or contacts with the armed groups regarding the release of the civilians who have been kidnapped by the armed groups and are still held inside, for example, eastern Ghouta or the areas controlled by those armed groups? Are there any efforts by the UN to contact them, to exert pressure in order to result in the release of those civilians? Thank you.
بعد التلفزيون السوري تحرير
مجلة اليسار. بعد التلفزيون السوري بس وخلص.
أنا تغريد ريشي رئيس تحرير مجلة اليسار. أرغب بسؤال شفاف جدا. هل الأمم المتحدة جادة في إنهاء النزاع في سوريا فعلا؟
Actually, it seems that what hinders the flow of humanitarian aid in general is the EU, US sanctions on Syria. What do you think of this, and how can we solve this problem?
إذا بقي وقت لحظة بس، إذا بقي وقت نرجع لك.
So in order to do, you've asked me some complex and detailed questions. In order to do justice to them, I think that's where I'm going to have to draw the line. So I can respond in the best way. So I was asked a question about essentially about how we know that aid gets to people who need it all over the country. And this is a very important question for not just everybody in Syria and all the authorities in Syria, but also the people who finance these programs. They want to know that aid is reaching the people who need it. And it can be, as you imply, very challenging to know in circumstances like the ones in Syria whether the assistance is getting through to the people who need it. And for that reason, the United Nations and all the organisations we work with put in place the most detailed possible arrangements to track what is happening, to gather information from all possible sources, to rely not just on those organisations which we are engaging with to provide the assistance, but to be gathering information from lots and lots of other places as well. One of the ways in which we assess the overall situation is because we get continuing reports about the status of people all over the country. So we get reports about places where there are, for example, acute malnutrition problems. We get reports about places where there are outbreaks of diseases. And one of the ways in which we know whether assistance is getting through to all of those, what you talked about as hotspots, is whether, having provided the assistance, we get information that those problems of disease and hunger and the limited availability of services, whether we're getting reports that those problems are being dealt with better now. But I want to reassure everybody that there is a shared interest between everybody that assistance that's provided gets to the people who need it. That is what the people of Syria want. That is what the authorities in Syria want. The government made it very clear to me that's what they want. That is also what those who provide and finance this assistance want. And I would also say to you, it is above all what the thousands of people who work on these programs, as I said to you, many of them Syrians, who are risking their own lives to do this. That is what they want. So everybody has the same interest in ensuring that through these efforts, the needs of the people are met. I said when I was talking about the problems in Eastern Ghouta that people in other besieged areas who need help should get that help too. That is the fundamental principle that governs us as I and my colleagues seek to discharge our mandate. And it applies just as much to Foua and Kafarya as it does to any other place. So I would like assistance to be getting to people who need it, wherever they are in the country. And the UN will do all it can, working with everybody, anybody who has influence over these matters, to ensure that that can be the case. Now, on a number of the other questions, some of the things that need to be done by organisations other than those which I engage with directly. There's a political dimension, there's a security dimension, and so on. And my mandate is on the humanitarian response, and I work with a humanitarian organisation. Of course, as a practical matter, on their own, the humanitarian organisations cannot solve all these problems. And I have colleagues in other parts of the United Nations who work on other dimensions of the challenge. But my focus is on the humanitarian. And we need, as humanitarians, to be ready to reach people as soon as we're able to do so. And that is what we will continue to focus on. On the question of the how long this conflict is going to go on, of course, from our point of view in the United Nations, the best solution is to seek peace. That's what we want. because that gives people, like the people I met in Homs yesterday, the chance to rebuild their lives. That requires a political process. And you all know that my colleague, Staffan de Mistura, who's the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for Syria, has been working very, very hard for many years, together with others, to try to move the political process forward. On the question of sanctions, this was a question that was put to me by various people who I have met during the course of my visit. And I'm going to explore that question further. I'm going to try to understand what the evidence is about the effect of sanctions, and then investigate all the information and see how we can take forward consideration of that issue. But the first thing I would like to see is more detailed evidence about what people mean when they say sanctions are a very big issue, and that evidence can come from a variety of different sources, and I've asked my office to play a role in trying to gather it and enable us to assess it, and I'm sure, because it's been raised as an issue that's of concern to the government, it will be something that comes up again in the further discussions that I have told you that I hope to be able to have in the period ahead. So thank you very much indeed. I appreciate probably you have a lot of other questions, but I hope you accept I've had a very short visit and I'm still in the middle of my meetings, and there are other people I'm very keen to see and hear from before I complete my work on this visit. Thank you very much indeed.
شكرا كثير لكم، بس بدي لكم ملاحظه انه البيان اللي بين ايديكم هلا في نقص، فاخذنا نحن البيان الموقع